One is already in. Not sure why it's not showing.
Let's stop the recording for a minute. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Diversity MBA Webinar Smart Series. My name is Pam McElvane. I am author and CEO of Diversity MBA Media and Learning Solutions. I'm so excited here today that you have joined us, both out in our virtual audience as well as live here with us today. I would like to conduct the webinar in such that I am going to share information, but those of you that are attending, feel free. When I will pause for times to ask questions. And that way you'll have an opportunity. And I also will do so at the end. So one of the things that I'll share with you that's really exciting to me, this is literally a chapter out of my book that's going to be released in September. The second book in the series of 6, The Skinny on Inclusion. My first book is The Skinny on Diversity Recruiting, Best Practice Guide to Recruiting Strategies. This book is Skinny on Inclusion, Best Practice Guides to Workplace Inclusion and Retention Strategies. What's so exciting about this particular book is that I read 25 books on inclusion and belonging to really be able to have a holistic approach and understanding of what organizations and people are doing and thinking around inclusion, workplace inclusion. I also learned so much more within this book than I had before. So this won't just be about sharing our best practice trends based on organizations that participate in our index, but also sharing real strategies that companies actually are doing. So with that, I will say to you that our insights, our research, before we get into the webinar, we've been conducting benchmarking surveys for the last 18 years. It's called the Inclusive Leadership Index. And within this index, we measure 8 categories. But we look at primarily overall the intersection of DEI and corporate strategy and talent management. So basically, how strategies are executed, for business acumen and integrating the development and advancement of talent, particularly focused on both women and people of color. However, the insights provide, more than 35,000. So we talk about all kinds of elements and components. But I wanted to share with you the basis of where the research come from. We have our average multinational. They have 35,000 employees and their average revenue of about 30 billion. And then we have our regionals that average about 5,000 employees, and they are around 6 billion in average. So we are a big company survey with a minimum of 1,000 participants. That's a requirement. So just so you know, that we do have the basis of research in what we're doing. So I'm excited to get started and really talk about something that people have been talking about for a long time. And this really is coming from my book that will be published. So just let me share with you that the presentation that I'm doing will be available for our corporate members. But those of you that are listening, this will be available on YouTube. It will also under the webinar channel, but it will also be available my book in September. So here we go. And I have with me my colleague, Kendall Grisham. So if you ask any questions or comments, I will pause for any of those in the chat that he can share. So engaging white men to create an inclusive culture. I call them, I'm going to be real with you, I call them our most influential champions because they are. Some people, think, why are we still spending time talking about why we need to help white men feel comfortable with creating diverse and inclusive workplaces. Well, the reality is that white men, they hold the most influential positions in corporate America and most large organizations. So they're about 80% of our Fortune 500 CEOs, and they're still more than 75% in the C-suites. So the reality is that white men hold the most influential positions in corporate America and large organizations. So it's not just necessary, but it's a business imperative that they understand how important they are to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at the end of the day, white men are the largest group of ready talent for advancement opportunities. Not saying that this needs to stop, but I'm saying we have to look at it differently. So it's not a myth, that white men are uncomfortable in understanding the nuances of diversity. They're like any other group. Once they have the experience and connection, it broadens their perspective, creates empathy, and allows them to be vulnerable. So I really want to spend this time in our webinar focusing on the importance and the business reasons to why white men need to champion our diversity and inclusion efforts. Don't misunderstand me, please. Many of the privileges and advantages over the generations that have given white men access that they have today, I am not minimizing, nor am I criticizing systemic and structural racism that impacts, what we do. I'm just saying that we need to shift the focus and move beyond the current narrative and polarization and implications that white men are leaning into reverse discrimination. So that's not a perception. That is the reality that we need to really close that gap. So I wanted to, take some time and talk about, so what is the business case? Why are we still talking about there's a business case with white men? There actually is. It's not just the business case for representation and diversity in leadership roles, but it's the business case why white men are our most influential champions. And they are. We need to remind them of that, of their position in the place in leading this work. So just a little sneak peek of history, just to remind some of us. Back in the 60s, and actually to teach some of the new generation, President Johnson implemented what they call the Plan of Progress. And actually, prior to President Johnson's executive order, President Kennedy had an executive order that really was requiring organizations to look at their workforces. And then President Johnson, added the icing on the cake, if you will, with his executive order and legislation behind it to give minorities the same opportunity, who have the same qualifications, and I'm saying minorities because this is how the government phrased it, in terms of being ready to advance, being able to counter equal pay. Susan Reed, actually, investigative journalist, wrote a book, Diversity Index, which really gives a very, very detailed view of what happened earlier in history. So the Plan of Progress was in place first with the executive order to support diverse recruitment in the leadership ranks. Then there's a few years later came affirmative action legislation, which was passed to hopefully move the acceleration of equalizing and leveling the playing field so that people of color, minorities could compete fairly. That's all it was about, giving access to compete. Everybody was qualified. And in fact, women and people of color were probably more qualified. And when you think about what happened in civil rights, other groups benefited more than the Blacks themselves. But back to, white men, they are the visionaries leading the Fortune 100 companies. And then in the late 50s, early 60s, they are the ones that truly believe in leveraging diversity, women and minorities. They did step up, they did lean in. And for example, companies and CEOs like GE, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, IBM, Walgreens, Lockheed, Oh, Xerox, HP, and the list goes on. People don't talk about this. These men, these visionary men, they stepped up. Oh, can't forget Chrysler. Oh, I love Iacocca. Can't forget him. But they stepped up and leaned into working with the government to level the playing field within their workplaces where they knew inequities lived and were stirring. So they too wanted to face the truth and diminish whatever barriers that existed. But let's be clear, it didn't, reduce their power or their influence in what they were doing. So that started a long time ago in terms of setting up what we needed to do. But now when we get into the reality of what's happened, particularly with SCOTUS, and I don't want to get into more in what's happening with our Supreme Court that's minimizing the rights of the human rights of people. I won't get into that. However, you hear me kind of coming into it a little bit anyway, but I will say they have dismantled some very, very, very significant legislation that our presidents previously have really put into place to try to allow for the advancement to occur. And so, so what is the business case for you talking about white men? Well, as I shared with you before, our index, I just want to share a couple things with you on what's happening in the population. So over here, when you see where white Americans, the census looks at its data every 3 to 5 years. So while it does the large census, it literally goes back and look at data to update it. And they do smaller segment of surveys. So in 2020, they updated the data, and the first census shows that 57.8% of white Americans, that's where they are. And it's amazing because it's the first time ever the white Americans, as defined by the census, were reduced. Now, keep this in mind that the US Census under white Americans, non-Hispanic, white, are also includes the Middle Easterners. Hey, our next census, they won't be included. What do you think is going to happen to that 57.8%? Yes, the white overall American population will be smaller even. But it's important to know that it is declining. And so that means, yes, the browning of America. The other one that's significant is who's in the workforce. And this is where an identity evolution is happening. Multiracial in the census, 9.7% or 33.1 million people identified multiracial, 2+ races. Now, not able to identify what those races are, but they're at least checking the importance of that. So what is the importance of for employers is to make sure you don't have other, but make sure you're able to have that multiracial box, 2+ races, and pretty soon, what are the 2+ races? You are going to see some impact on Hispanic, African American, Asian American, the decline of those numbers as people check what their ethnicities are. That's becoming more and more important today. So I just want to talk about that's what our population is. Now let's go into the workforce. Mind you, no need for white Americans to have issues about losing their competitive space because they are well positioned at the top. This diagram here, we haven't updated it yet from our 2024 work research, but it's not too different. Unfortunately, have to share with you. But what this chart illustrates here is that the ready talent pipeline, more than 70%, some cases, it's kind of sad here, but more than 70% of ready talent across all groups are white American. And within those management and leadership positions, each area has more than 40% of white men that are ready for advancement. And then more than 30% are white women in those positions and ready for advancement for management and leadership roles. So that means 25% of the rest are people of color or underrepresented groups. And so if you look at the bottom and you see the single digits and organizations wonder why they're struggling with having double digits, well, it's kind of tough if more than 70% of your workforce is one dominant group. So that's the critical mass story. That's the reality. That's not a perception. That's real. So the perception, unfortunately, is that white Americans, particularly white men, feel that they're excluded and they're not informed. So that's what I hope to do today, is to inform a little better the story that we should be telling. And so when we're talking about the business case, I say we need to make sure that we support strategies to accelerate diversification for women and people of color. But we have to we have to ensure that we're telling the right story and being very transparent about the information we share. Because we know the world has changed, but we also know that progressive CEOs recognize how important it is to have diversity and the integration within their leadership roles represented. We know workforce wants to see leaders mirror who they potentially can become. We also has already been quantified, validated that diverse thinking, diverse cultural differences, women being at these leadership tables bring more innovation, more productivity to the workplace ever than before. So we don't have to sit here and struggle, what that is. So why do I say our most influential group in corporate America and large employers are white men? Because they are. I am not saying they're not faced with barriers and obstacles. I am, however, saying that within the competing priorities that they have, it's important that they keep their eye on the ball and try to make sure that there is an opportunity and ways, in spite of what's happening with the Supreme Court, to accelerate women and particularly people of color or minorities, whichever you're more comfortable with. It really is going to take white Americans to shatter the glass ceiling, the glass cliff, the white ceiling, right? CEOs at the end of the day can't do it. They can only influence it. So what's important is that we all, what I want to say is that we all come to the table. We all become a part of what is necessary, to happen in this changing world. So the good news, though, I want to say is that companies are making excellent and significant strides towards achieving workplace inclusion and belonging. They've intentionally established programs to engage and support white men. But I do think that, and all employees, don't misunderstand me, but I do think we're not telling that story well enough and celebrating the champions so that, those that aren't hearing what they need to hear, those that are not understanding the narrative and the messages that their organizations are leaning into, perhaps organizations need to do the next thing. And that is go deeper within your organizations that are not necessarily HQ related. There's headquarters culture and then the subcultures that exist in the field, in the branch offices, if you're banks and service organizations, and the manufacturing plants, out in the field, if you're, doing railroad or energy utility work. You have to be able to have this robust continuum of messaging that people are getting all the information and being informed in terms of what you're doing to support all employees, and particularly white men. But companies aren't doing that great job of that. So let's talk about a few more realities. Now I want to go into, and if you have any questions, please put anything in the chat. But after me sharing that data with you, I hope that this is kind of, said, okay, this is another way I need to think about the business case. So the other thing is how employers engage white men. This is not something that I'm thinking about. This is not even my opinion. This is based on, oh my goodness, the hundreds of surveys that we have had over the years. And we asked the companies, what do you do? How do you know we said, what do you do to include them? How do you know they're included? How do you validate they feel like they're included? What are you doing to check and monitor the behavior to make sure the training had impact? We ask all these things and in our index, and they tell us, organizations tell us, and then we have ways to validate it. So let's look at the biggest number one indicator of inclusion. Organizations. So we ask companies, where is your range? Actually, this is from 2023. In 2025, we looked at the range a little closer. We looked at 100 to 95. But this is last year's results. So if you look at this, more than 50% of the companies are doing better than 70%. So 70%, more than 70% of the organization are saying, we feel pretty good. The workforce is saying, we feel great. But if the dominant workforce, I'm just going to throw this out there, you guys, if the dominant workforce are white Americans, and they're averaging about 70% in the workforce, well, and by the way, that's not just leadership. In some workforces, there's 70% in the workforce. In others, there are more diversity within the workforces. But think about it. This is an indicator. Also, it's an indicator of psychological safety and trust. So 70% or more of your dominant group is saying, yeah, I feel psychologically safe and trust. You got to look deeper at that number of folks that are not happy. So if you're getting an index of 85% and you're saying, oh, we did it. Hey, let's dance. Our engagement survey hit the spot. Well, you got 15% of people that are saying not so much. I don't think so. We need to double check what's happening with that. So I'm just stating, make sure your engagement surveys, your diversity surveys are just what that is, indicators. They are indicators to tell you how well you're doing and what you need to do to gain more insight, to make sure everyone in your workforce is feeling engaged. So now we ask companies, what are some of the key activities that you do to engage white men? And this is a 3-year trend, and I circled just a couple of the key areas. Because what's important is that well, there's a couple things here, and I love my companies. I love the companies for being real and honest and saying, hey, we want them to engage in everything. We want white men. We give them everything that they can engage. So for decades, companies been creating strategies that white men champion and are a part of. But know this. At HQ, and I'm going to call headquarters HQ. At HQ, white men are a lot more engaged and understand what's happening than the field group. And folks want to call them the frozen middle. No, I call them the critical middle. Advancing the critical middle, empowering the critical middle, informing the critical middle, making sure that those folks that are in the plants and the branches in the field understand what you're doing. And I think that's part of the gap. And part of the problem, where they feel that's when you get white men, that's why they're feeling excluded. But if they know, look at this trend over here, where we have companies actually created race training for white males, very specific training so they can feel better in the culture. If you look here, 2023, it went up to 19%. I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't looked at my 24 numbers. That is probably up a little bit more, because organizations are concerned and they don't want folks leaving and suing, right? Creating risk that's not really there because they don't have a full understanding of what's going on. The other thing, we see white men's networks. They're more like interest groups. They're not so much employee resource groups, but they're networks, and organizations are increasingly becoming okay with having networks as long as they're about advancing DEI. So they don't want the networks to be there where they are, driving any other type of adversity within the organization. But look at this. I mean, reverse mentoring, town halls, diversity council, ERGs, diversity training. White men have been allies. Allyship is the most prevalent practice that white males are championing. And while senior leaders, oh my goodness, when I think about what happened during the murder of George Floyd and just how, and people were talking about white fragility and all these things and making some negative in the windows. I think it was great because white men and women had an opportunity to feel and have empathy and be vulnerable to say, okay, I didn't understand it. And I still may not understand it or get it, but I want to be there to support and help provide awareness. And yes, other groups that are experiencing, I think, the challenges and of change and what happens in times like this, that you have to be in a place of educating on a continuum. Yeah, that gets tiring. But at the end of the day, that's the work. To be honest with you, that is the work. So we know that when you look at this number, more than 90%, regardless of what the stat is saying, companies are including white men. White men are participating in initiatives and programs, but the only reason they feel excluded is because they're not a part of it. They don't understand it. What they see in their peripheral becomes their reality. So we want to make sure that our communications and everything that we're doing in organizations are aligned. Because when you have more than 85% of companies also, according to our index, intentionally have programs that influence the culture of inclusion for white men, right? They're making sure white men are in ERGs, they're executive sponsors, they're diversity counselors, diverse slates, diversity training, town halls, leadership roles, cohorts. They're not being excluded. They're the dominant group in the workforce, but nonetheless, they're very much a part of championing the change. And so we got to tell that story. So just a few strategies that work, that we know work, because we ask companies, what are the detail? What are some specific detail of the strategies of what organizations are doing? So this is, going to be quite a bit that I'm going to share here. There's no questions. I don't see any coming in the chat. I'll take a break here. Are there any questions, Kendall, in the chat?
No questions so far.
Does anyone want to come off mute and ask a question? Okay. If not, I am going to continue. So strategies that work. This may seem like, wow, we know men as allies, but organizations are intentionally having initiatives to train now men as being better allies. And not just white men, women can be in there, people of color can be in there, minorities, underrepresented groups can be in there, understanding what this should be and focus. So, building the most significant opportunity is where they're helping build career and leverage relationships to help advance people who don't have access. So executive sponsors, being, advocates fundamentally are, the advocates for change. And while mentoring, peer-to-peer mentoring and virtual mentoring are the number 1 and 2 most used mentorings today, reverse mentoring has emerged to where it's now intentionally used as a transparent way to have real conversations. So it exposes senior leaders to learn more about generational opportunities. We have some CEOs who mentored with Gen Zs just so that they can get a clue on the next generation that's entering their workforce. Ethnic, white men, actually mentoring Black men and women and Hispanic and diverse, just understand their cultures, to have some experiences. So the reverse mentoring goes both ways. So, also the diversity executive councils, and these councils are there to help monitor and make sure that the strategies for inclusion are working and should be the way they, intended them to be. Organizations have, their inclusion councils that they do. Believe it or not, on these inclusion summits, that they're listening tours, not just for diversity leaders and HR leaders, but leaders that are part of other disciplines participate in the listening tours, and they're white males, and they're like, wow, I didn't even understand this. And in healthcare, believe this or not, and I don't know if there's any healthcare organizations here, but any of them that listen to them, they created very specific physician leadership programs for white male physicians to understand the idiosyncrasies of the clinical inclusion space, so they can too be sensitive in understanding what they need to do as allies and advocates and leaders. So it's really a healthy way of engaging white men. These are, we have some very many very specific strategies in what organizations are doing, but these are just a few. So if you have these in your organization, you're saying, how are white men being leveraged as champions versus, and are we communicating in such a way that they don't feel excluded? So we want to make sure, and let me just give you an example of that. When we're saying, oh, wow, we are doing, we're targeting Hispanic, we achieved our identity goals for LGBTQ and veterans and disabilities, and we've achieved our African-American goals, our Asian goals. Now we're going to, going after our Hispanic goal. We're going to achieve those. We're so excited. But if we don't share, we've achieved our women in leadership, right? We're talking about all these groups. But if we don't share where white men are in this, of course they're going to feel excluded. It's not intentional. It's just what happened. It's just what we did. So it's a real thing that they're feeling excluded. And what they're doing, they're suing now. And there's a lot of different reasons as to why, but they're being able to leverage what's happening with discrimination. But let me just be real, particularly for you guys, the leaders here. Journey to balance in the workplace is a thing. It really is. Being able to create balance in the workplace doesn't just, and we're not talking about just wellness for people, for mental and physical, the balance of generations. We're talking about what's happening, some of the polarization within the community coming in. At the end of the day, we're looking at for individual responsibility for people to own. I'm just going to be real. I read the other day, not long ago, actually, an article from Psychology Today, and they were talking about people behaving badly in the workplace. Well, that cannot be tolerated, whatever that looks like, however you define that consequence. Accountability has to be there for people behaving badly. You have to do something to help manage the imbalance of microaggressions that may exist between one group or another. And I guarantee you, regardless of what your size is, you can have different political beliefs, different religious beliefs that are in the workplace. And you want to be able to respect the differences. You want to teach, you have to teach. Employers, unfortunately, have to teach their workforce that we are one that respects the balance of respects the differences and disciplines of everyone. So how do we do that? We know that people of color, underrepresented groups, are used to putting themselves in a place where they're the ones minimizing of themselves a bit and assimilating. Because white Americans, the dominant group, they haven't had a reason to do that. It's not even natural for them to create balance in the workplace for others. It's a learned behavior. They have to adjust to it. They have to want to do it. It has to be a part of the bottom line and a priority for them to do it. It has to be a burning desire for them to want to change, because the reality is, in their day-to-day lives, it's not something that they think about. Those of us that are middle class, upper middle class, what have you, we have our children and we're raising them. But yet we have to make sure, and I'm not gonna lie, I have to tell my two brown boys, I had to tell them, you guys know what to do if you're stopped? Because I know now they're out of college, but I'm like, do you know what to do if you're stopped? And I have to tell their friends, oh, by the way, please don't do anything to get my boys in trouble, because you may get off and they may not. Particularly in an urban city like Chicago. I'm sitting here having that conversation. They don't have to think about that. They don't have to have those conversations. So it's very, that's a hard truth. But the dimensions of diversity that include white Americans, we by no means did not mean to exclude the dominant group when we're talking about, the balance and what it means. But let's be real, when we talk about person with disabilities, you talk about the LGBTQIA community, plus community, non-binary community. You talk about veterans. Those are dimensions of diversity, but they're predominantly white Americans. And most of those groups are predominantly white men when you look at the makeup of the white population within those. So that's just our reality. So when we're talking about, the journey, and then we lean in to talk about privilege, we're not excluding, any groups at all. We're just stating what the reality is in our society. So how do we create a balance in our environments? I know, I thought about this question, and this was in my book, and I really did a lot of reading and research around it. And I know you all know about, the learning cycle, right? What is the continuous learning cycle? Well, there's a permanent continuous cycle of learning, adapting to new experiences that we all have to do. So not just white Americans, not just white males, but we all have to be in this place of this learning loop where we're doing the cycle, we're learning for a cycle of positive reinforcement. This is not for me. I just added a couple of things on here, but this is something that is fundamentally the mindset shift that we have to have. I know I have to work on it. I don't want to judge people that I meet and make connections to, but some of the realities I might do that. And I have to work on myself not to do that. So the continuous cycle of learning, continuous development, continuous education, continuous improvement, continuous expansion, exponential, right? It has to be a cycle that doesn't stop. And that's how we have to approach it for when we're talking to white men. We have to approach it that, this is not something that we want you to do now. This has to be something that has to be a part of your journey. So you become experienced, you become aware of what's going on with change. We know that you're in a place where others have to adapt to you. That has to become part of your reality, that you too need to be able to adapt to others as you learn their experiences, as you learn what that means to them. We're not looking for you to do something that no one else is doing. DEI itself creates the process that DEI implements this all the time. This is what it does. It creates a place for employees or your associates to be in different cultural dimensions that's different than their own every day. Not just around the proficiency of the skill of the work they're doing, but around the people they are with, that they're able to adjust this agility and this mindset by seeing the continuous learning aspect of what cultural change brings as a positive. It becomes what we call our value proposition for positive positioning. So it requires the continuance of learning. It requires us to be in a mindset to position ourselves in a positive disposition so that we can be in a place to accept new challenges and absorb it. Know that if you mentally say, I'm in this life cycle of a continuous learning place, and no matter where I'm at in my professional career, I want to be in a place that continues to develop. And if you think about it, every time you're promoted or advanced or given a new assignment, you got to work on that development. And if I want to, stay there and reskill and create the upskills, education becomes a part of that. Not just the academic, not just the traditional, but education through experience, experiential learning, the time spent with others. We talked about all those programs that companies do to engage white men and others to basically have the practical application for understanding how people are learning in their organization. That becomes a value proposition for you. That becomes currency for you. Continuous improvement, the mindset that you're saying, I can always do better, be better, by learning from you, and I'm going to have a place and create a space for that. So all this continuous cycle of positive positioning and learning gives me expansion. Almost like the 2-year-old. Do you know their brain absorbs 100 times faster than an adult's at 2? They're sponges. Go back to that. And that's a mindset that we have to work on ourselves to get back to. So, yes, it's tough when you're sitting here dealing with a group that has privilege. And you're like, wow, this group is embedded in privilege. And because of their privilege, they want me to now understand where they are. Well, yeah, put yourself in this space of that continuous learning cycle. And let's understand privilege. And so you notice I didn't say white privilege because privilege, I'm telling you, is a class thing. Let's get real. It is, really. It is, depending on the society. Have you been to India, the monolithic societies, parts of Africa, parts of Europe? Come on. Those monolithic cultures, trust, privilege is knee deep. They're in there deep under the dirt where privilege is. But when we were talking about it here in America, North America, this is related within the whole D&I definition of it. George Floyd brought the privilege up. We were talking about life privilege. We were talking about what happens with people of color on a daily basis. We really were not trying to minimize privilege as it related to you as a white man or white women in your journey in this life. That was never the intent. We were just wanting to uplift it and raise the awareness of privilege. And so at that point, what we learned as a society was, who is it that needs to understand what privilege they have? I think we basically realized that everybody needed to understand what privilege they have, because at some level, if I am an upper middle class mom with upper middle class boys, well, yeah, we are privileged. Still have to be careful on what happens in society, but we are privileged. Those of you all on this call, just got to be real. Hate to break it to you, but yeah, we are privileged. But we get that socioeconomic side based on where we are in the privileges and how that looks. And it's the way we approach talking about privilege to white Americans. White women, they naturally, nurturers being more sensitive, they did not feel as, I don't want to use that word, as paralyzed, I'll say, as white men did. The anger and the things that showed up and that, came from depths of them being the dominant group and not having to deal with bias, not having to check themselves, not having to be uncomfortable in daily environments, not having to define their identity on a daily basis. They were angry. And with this anger, because they felt that they were being attacked by something they did not understand. And it was not ever the intent. That was never the intent. But that unfortunately became one of the outcomes. So when that happens, we have to step back and say, within all of this, we need to make sure we talk about privilege in the entire context of it. So, what do I mean by that? I mean that we have to look at it in terms of how it manifests in the many different ways. So when we talk about hardship, I'm just going to be real. I did do a blog on white privilege. In fact, I did a white paper series. This dawned on me. And boy, did I get a lot of feedback on that thing. I really did. And people came back, a lot of white males. In my LinkedIn too. I didn't know I had that many angry white men on my LinkedIn. They came back and said, oh gosh, my parents were immigrants. They came over here. They worked hard. And then I worked hard and we didn't get any help from anyone. We had to scrape from the bottom and no one said that you didn't. No one said that you didn't have a hardship. But what you didn't understand was the inherent access to opportunities built in because you were white. What you didn't understand were the inherent acknowledgments, head shakes that you got, eyebrows that you got because you were white, and you might have made a mistake and you got the pass, but we didn't. So it's the nuances and those things that other cultures didn't get that white men and then subsequent white women achieved. And that's what we wanted to help understand. So we want white men to be able, our champions who are most influenced, to tell the story, how it manifests and what privilege looks like, so that others can join in within the dominant group and say, hey, we want to clarify these societal impacts that are, influencing the wrong perceptions that we want people to have. And let me just say this about perceptions. Perception is individual, and so is that reality. So your individual perception, they say perceptions, this is a myth. Oh, perception is reality. No, your perception and what you define that to be is your reality. So let's be clear. If you have a perception that's misguided, it's our responsibility to help you understand the reality, to inform you and give you the information of what the reality is. And if you still want to be in your own individual perception, that's fine, because when reality hits, it will hit harder and it won't show up in a way that you recognize. It will be painful. And that's what privilege is. It's really recognizing, where you are within the society and what benefits you have on it, and know that everybody isn't the same, because the societal in groups that we have that helps manifest structural, institutional, and systemic racism, I do define those as different, because the structural stuff is what happened out of slavery. Then that stuff got institutionalized because we got it in housing and education, right? All those disparities in healthcare, all of it became structural. And then it's systemic when you create policies and practice around it in your workplace, in your communities, in your legislation. It becomes systemic because you made it a rule and a process that had to be adhered to. Now, those things can be mitigated, but my goodness, to break those down, we are experiencing that today. And is that privilege? Is that privilege what's driving us in the rights and mitigating and dismantling things? It absolutely is. But know that your reality is your experience, and it is an experience, and we want to appreciate that. So when you're talking to advancing the critical middle, you're talking to folks that aren't in HQ, but that are in different parts of the organization. You do want them to have the experience and feel good about their place in it. We never made it a priority to exclude anyone in the conversation of inclusion. We never did. That was never anyone's intent to do that. But let me tell you, folks that have a problem, and yes, I'm going to say white males, this does include everybody, but I'm talking to the white men right now. Those of you that have a problem that want to call it reverse discrimination and go sue, look at what's happening with leadership. We've now found in research that it is a performance issue. It's either a poor manager or that person, that employee is that, that unfortunately that white male employee is having a performance issue, but they have created a narrative, a false narrative that allows them to litigate. And so and I don't blame them. If I'm not performing well, if I have a poor manager managing me and I am performing well, either way, anywhere in that middle, I don't want to hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I really don't. I want, to be treated better and fairly as somebody to handle what's happening to me. So, those are just some thoughts around those. My book goes deeper into those things, but I'm telling you, we have to be able to acknowledge the manipulation of privilege and accepting what it means when we're trying to, when being silent, complicity shows up, the imposter syndrome. We have to be in a place where we, what do I want to say? where we can recognize this. There's so much work and research on the imposter syndrome. I was reading from uh, author Claire Jose, who talked about the imposter syndrome, perfectionism, paralysis of people pleasing, procrastination. These are some of the traits that, show up and doubt and what have you. So people, aren't authentic. They aren't what we say we want them to be. So you will get, that showing up, including in white males in a dominant culture. They too will, be one way. Believe it or not, they too will assimilate at work. And that means assimilating to a culture that's changing that they don't necessarily want to be a part of because they don't see any value in it. And you won't know that until it costs you. So we have to be, careful how that shows up and when that shows up. I've been doing a lot of talking. So I don't see any notes in chat. So I just want to,
We do have a question, Pam.
oh, great. We'll pause for a question. Yes.
Question is, what are suggestions for responding to those that have privilege and periodically ask the question, are we doing too much in the DEI space?
Hmm. Well, I'm going to talk about, some considerations before judgment. That's a tough question. That's a good question. Um, so sometimes people don't understand. I mean, that's a tough conversation, right? That we have to have when we're trying to have a conversation around privilege. They don't understand that they have it. And so engaging them into hoping they'll be in a place to have an open and honest conversation around privilege, I would say try to have it holistically around what overall privilege is, and then perhaps some examples of where, you may appear to be privileged in one area and you're not in another. So you could be privileged based on the kind of job you have or your socioeconomic status, but you're not privileged in being a person of color. You still consider safety. You still consider what would happen to you if stopped by a police officer, so on and so forth. And not all police officers, but some. So you can, and then ask them about, how they feel different and where they don't have to worry about certain things. So you have to try to get to a place to level set. That's hard. That's not easy, but it's where you can get to a place of asking questions of them. And then when you get into the DEI space, because people can't think of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, if they don't understand it. And if they think, if they're questioning diversity, equity, inclusion, then they think it's part of it. They think it's fractionalized. They think it's not something that's holistic for the entire organization. They think part of it is exclusionary. So they need to understand fundamentally what it means. They need to know that they're included and as part of being of the diverse group. I mean, cognitive diversity is the place where most organizations go first. They'd say how we think different. Europeans that grow up in different parts of the world that have different disciplines. And that's true. All white men in the room can have lots of cognitive diversity and cultural diversity. Coming from Ireland and Switzerland, two different things. They sometimes don't even get along. But so you can have all of this. So helping them understand that diversity is more than just race. It's all these things. There's 64 dimensions. So we have to uneducate with that. And what is a workforce with in a workplace without diversity? I mean, are you saying you don't value the differences of others, of your peers, of your colleagues, of your leaders? You almost have to break it down in a Socratic way and getting them to say, well, no, that's not what I'm saying. Are you saying you don't want an equitable place where everyone is fairly paid for positions based on experience, based on skill? No, I'm not saying that. Or are you saying you don't want to be an inclusive and a belonging environment? You don't want to respect people, treat them fairly. Are you saying you don't believe in that? Of course, no, I'm not saying that. So and it's unfortunate that we're at this place, but we are at this place that we have to break down what the D, the E, the I, the B, the A. We have to break down what all those things mean. And it's not these acronyms that define what's happening within the culture. And so when you do that, I've taken the time to do that. I'm telling you, it's exhausting, but I've done that. Then they go back and they'll rethink it, and you can have a good conversation around it. So probably not what you wanted to hear because you're like, wow, Pam, that sounds like more work. Yeah, it is. It is. And but the good news is when you reach one and teach one, they probably will reach and teach tenfold who we have. I don't know if I answered everything. Maybe some food for thought. Okay, so
The I was just going to say that the person that asked the question was happy for the response.
thank you so much. So now, considerations. Let me see. We talked about so we're talking about what happens, what we need to do. We're looking at privilege. So considerations I'm saying that folks can make before judgment, kind of what we were talking about. That was actually a great question. It's to neutralize, negativity, almost where emotional intelligence come in. So neutralize by listening. Do you know that's what I do? I will listen and ask questions when somebody is anger and actually really bring it down because then it's conquered by understanding. Emotional agility is being able to somebody calls you a name and you're angry and you want to lash at them. You're able to take a deep breath in 5 seconds, calm yourself down, and say, and what else can I help you with? You want to conquer by understanding, asking questions for clarity. This is what's going to help you get there before you even make a judgment and help and teaching them in the process of, how we can move through this continuous journey of learning that we're in. And I call it prevail by allowing empathy and vulnerability to show up. When we do that within ourselves, they'll do it too, because at the end of the day, white men are our greatest champions and friends and influencers, just like all the rest of us are. We all have the same qualities. They just have an opportunity for more access. And then reading, I'm gonna tell you, the audio or however we're doing it these days and podcasts to continue. It's a way to continue your learning and developing your self-awareness. It's really required today. I'll tell you, it's something that we must do is take that time and continue to self-develop ourselves, particularly in what's happening in a polarized environment. And some folks were asking me, what do we do, Pam, in a culture that is becoming polarized around elections and what's happening? I'm saying, well, let's go dust off what we did with the murder of the George Floyd era and all the critical learnings that we did for authentic conversations for Asians and Hispanics and Latinos and LGBTQIA hate crimes. Let's dust those tools off and give them back to our managers. Let's put our leaders in the forefront so they can remind everybody that, hey, we're here. We're here to create this trusted place for you, this trusted environment for you. So real quickly, I know this ends in the next 10 minutes, but I want to run through some of the best practices for engaging white men. Just real quickly. These are coming from things that our organizations are doing. And I'm just going through them. Our best practice organizations are literally being intentional. Clear, consistent narrative and message on inclusion. So that's where corporate communications, HR, and DEI are coming together to make sure that their messaging on whatever they do is clear and transparent across the organization in the many different platforms that you have. All of the intranets, the internal social media, and whatever you do is consistent with what you have for external. Being transparent on target workforce strategies, like I talked about before, let folks know we're over indexed in white Americans in this area. That's why we want to diversify. We have this commitment to do that. Be transparent so they know how to have those conversations themselves. Also, show how white men are engaged in the organizational programs. Remind them that they are a part of change, that you guys really have been there all the time. And so let's uplift that for them because they too should know that they are included and then can work in the way that most of them do. It's the majority of them, many of them are supportive. It's just the few that aren't. And review the feedback that comes from them. Ask the questions. When I ask companies, so how do you know that they're engaged? They're all in these training, these programs. How do you know? They ask them, how'd you feel about that? And most of them were like, this was great. I didn't even think of inclusion this way. I didn't think of diversity this way. So for the most part, they really are good about it. Ensure issues of behavior are not performance related. Let's be clear. What's diversity is not HR. It's not performance. Delineate those. Be bold about that. Be clear about that. Be compliant about that. Executive sponsors hosting fireside chats with white male groups. That was a huge success. A couple of our companies did that. That was great. They said it was so good because think about it. White leader sharing to, middle managers and professionals that are white males and telling them like it is and their journey and so on and so forth, getting asked the hard questions and being able to create the narrative and, and establish so it permeates within the culture. It's great. It was great. And they did, and they were able to do it virtually as well. It was good having those virtual coffees and things like that. And of course, we all know reverse mentoring, both with focus on identity, generation, and ethnicity, is excellent. Some companies, as you saw in the data, saw it was necessary to have some networks, some summits, some retreats, so that white men could focus on themselves and understand what they uniquely needed to do, what was great about them, and what needed to change about them. So those sometimes are necessary. Companies decided when they needed to do it, and then they did it. And what is becoming very popular is the retraining, the re-engagement on the effective of allyship, kind of for everybody. And ERGs who are having, allyship type of intersectionality relationships where folks are cross-pollinating different groups, that's a great way to enhance allyship. That's a great way to let your ERGs leverage that. And then finally, quarterly polls, virtual polls, 3 questions, not over extended, where you're just checking the pulse on everybody. But definitely you can do it if you do a function or training where there's everybody in it and there's white men, find out what's happening and then uncover what's going on. Be clear that what you don't have to guess what you're understanding. Go ask them and then just be clear on it. Okay, so with that, I just want to say, thank you for the opportunity to share with you this insights. It's one of my chapters. I hope this was informative. Look for more detail coming out on all kinds of inclusion and belonging strategies in September, available on Amazon. But here you got a sneak peek, and I hope you, enjoyed today's presentation. And Pam McElvane, author and CEO of Diversity MBA. It was my pleasure. You can take off the